Hi, in this video, I'll walk you through all the features of the great free synth Dexed version 0.97. Dexed is a multi-platform, multi-format plugin synth that is closely modeled on the Yamaha DX7. Dexed is also a MIDI cartridge librarian/manager for the DX7. This is not a tutorial on FM synthesis per se, but I'll be showing examples as we go along the way. Refer to the chapters section in the description to jump to the areas of the synth that interest you the most. A download link has been provided in the description as well. Let's first take a look at the global settings and parameters. First up, we have the master level control with this knob. With the transpose knob, we can raise or lower the pitch in semitone values. By default, Dexed is polyphonic, but you can set it to monophonic mode by clicking this control. Now you can't play multiple notes at the same time, only one. This is useful for basses. With the init button, you reset your patch to the init state. Let's say that we changed here a few parameters. I'm just randomly changing things here. With the init, it should all go back to where it was. When you click the cart button, you'll see the directory where you have all your Dexed sound banks installed. This is the default directory. And you simply browse to the sound bank that you want and double click to load it. You see as I double click, the voices or patches change. And to load a specific voice, you can double click it here. If you click on the show dir or show directory button, you'll be taken in your file system to where you have the DX7 cartridges or 6.6 files installed. If you click on the load button, you can browse your file system to find sound banks that are not inside of your directory. We can also change voices by clicking here in the name and then selecting a new one, or by using the up or downward arrows like so. When we want to store our sounds, we click here on the store button and we are presented with a few choices. We can change the name of the voice. Program destination is where you want to store that new voice to in terms of the slots in your currently loaded cartridge. For example, here, if I select another slot, for example, Plux, it will overwrite that voice. And store action, you have a few options. First one is storing the program to a DAW plugin song state, or you can store the program and create a new copy of the current cartridge, or store this program, the voice, the patch, and overwrite the current cartridge. Once you select an option, just click OK. Or you can click external file to save it as an external file. If we click on the options button on the top left, we can find our audio MIDI settings. And you can save the current state of your synth, load a saved state, or reset to default state. There are certain controls like the level and the tuning, and if I recall correctly, the transpose, that are not loaded on the specific preset itself. So if you make changes to these and want to reset them to the original state, the init button won't help you do that. As you can see here, if I set the level to somewhere else, and if I click the init button, it's not going back to default. And if I change patches, the level stays there. So if I want to reset these controls or the state of the synth to its default state, I click on Reset to Default State. And conversely, I could save the current state as an external file. And obviously, this external file cannot be read by a DX7. Only 6.6 files can be read by the DX7. Let's now head into the parameters section by clicking on the parameters button. First up, we have the pitch bend range selection. With these controls, we can set the number of semitones available when we push our pitch wheel up or down. Each of these increments is a semitone. If I now play a note and push my pitch bend wheel all the way up, the pitch will rise in 7 semitones. When pitch bend step is used, two things happen. First of all, instead of having a smooth glide between the notes like so, in its default state, we will now get a stepped pitch bend like so. And the size of the steps is going to be determined by this value. Each numeric value will correspond with a semitone. For example, here it's set to steps of 1 semitone. If we push this up, then this would be steps of 3 semitones. Let's check it out. All the way up to 12, which is just one big step. With this switch, we can show or hide the keyboard. We can select the UI scaling here using the value of your choice. Engine resolution, there are 3 of them. Mark 1 is very close to the original DX7. Modern 24-bit has a more modern sound, less noisy. And OPL series closely resembles the OPL series chips. I'm going to leave it at its default Mark 1 value. Dexed is also a librarian, and we can hook it up to our DX7 and change patches and control other features by selecting the right MIDI output. Over on the right-hand side, we have options for real-time control, but we'll circle back to those later. Here we have options for changing the tuning or the micro-tuning of your synth if you so desire. You can load up tuning files by clicking on these buttons. With this button here, you can choose how Dexed will behave in terms of the micro-tuning or the tuning changes that you have made. You can look up more information by reading this pop-up window here. Finally, if your MIDI controller supports MPE, you can activate this control and set the bend range to a value that you desire. Let's now close this window out. The operators. The DX7, as well as Dexed, includes 6 operators. You can see them here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Each operator is a combination of an oscillator, an amplifier, and an envelope that controls that amplifier. It's very important to understand that each operator is completely independent from the other operators. So in a way, each operator is a mini synth inside the synth. Also very important to understand is that the oscillator inside the DX7 and Dexed operators only put out a sine wave. So there's no selector to choose a waveform because it only puts out a sine wave. The operator can be set to ratio mode or fixed mode. When in ratio mode, the operator multiplies the frequency number of the played note by the ratio value. Let's see how this works. We have a coarse control. This pitch coarse control allows us to change the ratio number in whole number increments like so. So going back to our definition, when we play a note, for example A4, which corresponds to 440 Hertz, the operator will multiply this frequency by the number set here. In this case, it is multiplied by 1, so we get the same frequency that we are playing. However, if we set this coarse control to 2, our base frequency 440 will be multiplied by 2, and we will get 880 Hertz back, which is an octave higher, and so on and so forth. Now, it's very important to understand that we're not raising the octaves here, like this is not 3 octaves or 4 octaves. This is multiplying our base pitch by this number, which is not the same thing. The pitch fine control allows us to set the ratio number in non-whole number values. For example, what if I wanted a ratio to be 3.3 or something like that? We can use the fine control for that. the tune knob breaks down the smallest frequency fine increments that we get here, for example, from 0.03 to 0.06, into 15 increments. 7 increments above the middle point, and 7 increments below the middle point. So this -7 means that the tune knob is set to -7 steps or increments below the midpoint 0. Very important to understand that this tune control and these steps aren't semitones. They are 1/15 of each of these fine steps. Let's set this back to its default state by clicking on the init button. Each operator has its own envelope generator that controls the level of that particular operator. Each envelope consists of 4 rates, this second row here, and 4 levels, this first row over here. DX7 style envelopes differ from typical ADSR envelopes in that an ADSR envelope only presents 4 controls, one for attack time, then another one for decay time, another one for sustain level, and a 4th one for release time, whereas the DX7 style envelopes present 8 controls, 1 rate and 1 level control for each of the 4 points. So it's more advanced than an ADSR envelope, and there are very specific things that you can accomplish with DX7 style envelopes that you can't with a standard ADSR. Going in depth into how the DX7 style envelopes work is beyond this video, but for now, what I want to mention is that rate 1, you can think of it as the attack time. Rate 4, you can think of it as the release time, while level number 3, you can think of it as the sustain level of an ADSR envelope. So rate 1 is the same as attack time. I'm going to play a note, and by default, it is in its maximum state and the fastest rate available, which is 99. If I turn this to the left, the rate will be slowed down, and you can see the depiction, the image here of the envelope, that it went from a straight line into a more sloped line. So right now the attack is softer. I also said that rate 4 is the same as the release time in an ADSR envelope. Let's check that out. As I turn it to the left, we should hear release. There we go. And level 3, we can consider it sustain level. So let's lower it a little bit. And now we have a very sharp transient here, but we want the transient to be more gradual. So we're going to slow down the rate number 3. There we go. Let's initialize our patch once more. And now let's focus our attention on these other controls. The key velocity sensitivity control, this knob over here, what it does is it makes the keyboard or the synth sensitive to velocity, meaning when this control is all the way to the left, it doesn't matter with what velocity I play the keys, we get the same level. However, if we turn it all the way up, the synth will be sensitive to velocity, so low velocity notes, their level will be softer, while high velocity notes will have a higher output level. So I'm going to play very softly. You can barely hear those notes. Now, higher velocity, lower velocity. Great. Next up is amplitude modulation sensitivity, but we'll circle back to this one when we discuss modulation. Next up, let's cover keyboard rate scaling and then keyboard level scaling, which are two completely different things. Keyboard rate scaling. If you think of a real instrument such as a grand piano, the notes on the left-hand side, the low notes, have a lot of decay, a lot of sustain. You could say that their amplitude envelope is very long. However, if you play notes on the right-hand side of the piano, like the really, really high notes, they are very plinky. They have very little sustain or decay. You could say that their amplitude envelope is shorter or faster than that of lower notes. So keyboard rate scaling will help us change the speed of the envelopes depending on the key that we are pressing. As we turn this control up, what will happen is that the high keys will now have a faster envelope than keys on the left-hand side, the lower keys. Let's check that out. Let me slow down the attack from immediate to fast-ish. Okay. Without rate scaling, if we play a note down here, it has a softish attack. And if we play up here, it has a certain attack. But if we turn up the key rate scaling, the low note is still going to have a softish attack. However, the high note, it's more plucky now. It has like a shorter amplitude envelope cycle. Let's bring the key rate scaling all the way back to 0. Softish attack. With keyboard rate scaling added, now it's pluckier. Let's now cover keyboard level scaling. Keyboard level scaling increases or decreases the operator level based on the key that is pressed. And we have 5 controls for that. We have a breakpoint, a left side depth, a right side depth, and then we have the curve that we can apply on the left side and the curve that we can apply to the right side. Like I mentioned, keyboard level scaling will increase or decrease the operator level here based on the key that is pressed. So how do we do that? First, we're going to set up a breakpoint and check out here the value on that tiny screen. And for example, let me set it to C3. Okay, we have set our breakpoint. What this does is above the breakpoint, we can set a certain behavior, and below the breakpoint, another one. So here we're going to say, let me turn up the depth of the right side all the way up. And what this curve will do is, this is a downward sloping linear curve. So as we play higher notes, the level of the operator is going to go down linearly. Let's try that out. And it's not going to happen directly at the breakpoint. It tends to happen like an octave or so above the breakpoint. Let's check it out. Actually, let me play with my controller. The notes here are very low level. Okay, we could set it to exponential negative, which means that instead of having a linear behavior beyond the breakpoint, we won't hear much change, but it'll get to a point where the change will be very drastic. Let's check it out. Okay, so the notes here for around 2 octaves kept the same level behavior, but then it started to exponentially decrease. Conversely, we could set the curve to go up instead of down, meaning above the breakpoint, the level will increase. Let's check it out. Okay, so this note here has a higher level than this one. And the same thing applies. This could be an exponential curve going up. And this is just the right side of the keyboard, the right side of the breakpoint. But we could set the left-hand side to behave completely different or to behave the same. For example, we could say the lower that we go, we want an exponential decrease. Like so. Or it could be just like the right-hand side where the level increases linearly or exponentially. With the right depth or left depth, you control the strength of the keyboard level scaling. Both the rate scaling and the keyboard level scaling are controls that are useful if you want a certain feel or a certain behavior when playing all the notes of your keyboard. However, if you write patches, if you create patches just for a certain range, for example, if you create a pad that will sound good, let's say on these 2 octaves, for the most part, it doesn't matter how they sound above or below their intended octave range, right? But this is very important if you are intending to play live and if you play like solos and use the entire range of the keyboard. That's when the rate scaling and the keyboard level scaling come into play and are very useful. A final concept when it comes to the operators is that they can be set to a ratio mode, where we talked about this frequency multiplier, or they could be set to a fixed mode. In a fixed mode, instead of multiplying the frequency you're playing, it will put out a specific frequency no matter what note you play. For example, if we set the chorus to 1000 Hertz, it doesn't matter what key we play, we'll get 1000 Hertz or 1 kilohertz. And we also have the possibility of micro tuning or fine tuning, and also using detuning. And why would you want to have a fixed frequency? Well, it turns out that certain sounds in nature or certain kinds of instruments like glassy or metal instruments, sometimes they have resonances, they have inharmonics, components of their sound that are not related to the pitch, that no matter what note you play, you get that same sound with that same pitch that doesn't change. So that's what the fixed mode is useful for. All that we just covered was how an operator works. Now, in FM synthesis, of course, because we're starting with sine waves, this is a very boring sound. So how do we actually make more complex or interesting sounds? That's when FM synthesis kicks in. And in FM synthesis, this is an operator, but an operator could serve as a carrier or could serve as a modulator. A carrier is any operator whose output goes to the DAC, the digital audio converter, or to the audio output. And by convention, typically when setting up the configurations of modulators and carriers, also known as algorithms, you'll tend to see carriers appear on the bottom of the screen, and a carrier is connected directly to the output, meaning you can hear its output. For example, here we only have operator 1 active, and it is playing a role of a carrier. How do I know this? Because it's on the bottom row, and I see that it's connected to the audio output. But an operator could also function as a modulator. In this case, operator number 2, we see is feeding operator 1, and it is feeding it modulation data. We can't hear the output of operator 2 because it is serving as a modulator. When we feed the output of a modulator into a carrier, we'll end up with a more complex wave than we originally started out with. For example, here, we have a very simple sine wave. Even though you can see that this modulator is feeding this carrier, modulator 2 for the moment has its level at 0. So the moment that I start increasing the level, we should start hearing how the sine wave turns into something else. Let's check it out. we can play with the level control of the output to create a more harmonically rich sound, like so. And consider that if we turn up the level, we introduce a lot of brightness into the sound and overtones, and at lower levels, the sound is going to be darker with less overtones. Also, depending on how you set the frequency of your modulator, the carrier's wave will become more complex or will sound different. For example, if I turn this coarse control to 2, that's a very different kind of sound. Now it's more reedy, kind of like a square wave, and I could keep going up. A few minutes ago, I mentioned in passing the concept of the algorithm. Think of an algorithm in FM synthesis as a pre-made configuration of carriers and modulators. The DX7 and Dexed, they both have 6 operators. Mathematically, how many combinations are there or permutations of carriers and modulators using 6 individuals? You could possibly come up with hundreds, if not thousands of combinations. The clever engineers at Yamaha, they figured out that not every combination will put out a pleasing sound, and they found that certain combinations were more useful than others. So they came up with these 32 pre-made configurations that they called algorithms, which is what both Dexed and the DX7 come with. And by turning the algorithm knob, you'll see how the configuration of the operators changes. Sometimes you have 3 carriers, each with its own modulator, and sometimes you only have 2 carriers with modulators on top of them. So there's 32 algorithms to choose from. And feedback, this feedback control, what it does is, when you turn it up, the output of the operator or the carrier with the feedback loop will feedback onto itself or into another modulator, and this will create a more complex wave. For example, in this case, the output of modulator 6 is going back to its modulation input, but check this out. In this algorithm number 6, the output of carrier 5 is going back to the input of modulator 6. Let's initialize our patch once more. Next up, the LFO section. The LFO section is found here. Let's go over the controls. This knob controls the speed. This knob introduces a delay, and here we can select the waveform or the shape of the LFO. On Dexed, you can assign the LFO to the pitch, to the amplitude of the operators, or to both at the same time. When we assign the LFO to the pitch or to the amplitude, we're going to call that a direct modulation because it's a modulation that's always on. We can't control it in real time. Okay, so to route the LFO to the pitch, what we'll do is turn up this PMD knob. It stands for pitch modulation depth. I'm going to play a note. Let me just raise here the tuning so we can hear it better. So with the speed, we can make it faster or slower. We can introduce a delay. So when we play a note, as we keep playing the note and hold with our finger, the LFO will come in after a short bit, depending on the length of the delay, or longer. We can set the waveform or the shape. Great. This PMod sensitivity control, you need to adjust it along with the PMD or pitch modulation depth to get the sound that you want. It's very important to mention that when you apply a direct modulation of the pitch, this pitch modulation affects all of the operators at the same time. You can't pick and choose which operator is going to be affected by the pitch modulation. Let's now cover the amplitude modulation. Let me bring down the switches relating to the pitch modulation. And for that, we have the amplitude modulation switch. So let me turn this all the way up. Let's play a note. Oh, great. Just kidding. As opposed to the pitch modulation, we can pick and choose which operators are affected by the amplitude modulation. And to choose the operators that we want to be affected, simply head over to the operator and turn this A mod sensitivity switch up. It stands for amplitude modulation sensitivity. And between the amplitude modulation sensitivity and the AMD controls, you can set it up the way that you want. Like I said, you can pick and choose which operators are affected by amplitude modulation. So let's just do something very simple here. I'm going to set this to this kind of sound. And I could choose to only affect this operator with the amplitude modulation. And it has a certain sound, or I could choose the other or both. This LFO key sync switch, when active, it resets the LFO every time we press a key. So we get the same sound because the LFO starts at the beginning. However, if it's deactivated, the LFO is free running, and whenever we press our key down, the LFO will just pick up where it was. This control here, oscillator key sync, isn't for the LFO. This is actually a global setting. Similar to the LFO key sync control, when the oscillator key sync control is active, every time we press our key down, the oscillator will restart. And it's also important to mention that this affects all of the oscillators inside the operators in the entire synth. You can't pick and choose which operator, which oscillator from which operator is affected by this. And the same as with the LFO key sync, if you deactivate it, the oscillator will be free running. So whatever you play, it will simply pick up where in the duty cycle of the waveform it is. And just to show you, you can apply the pitch modulation and the amplitude modulation at the same time. So let's bring this control up, as well as the pitch modulation sensitivity. Otherwise, the pitch modulation won't work. So there we have both. Great. This is the LFO section, and what I showed you is called direct modulation. Let's now tackle real-time modulation. For that, let's reset our synth once more. And let me change the tuning just so we can hear it better. Okay, what if we wanted to use pitch modulation, but only when we turn up our mod wheel? To do that, make sure that the PMD control is all the way down to the left, and you need to make sure that this PMod sensitivity control has a value. Then we're going to come here to the parameters button to open the parameters window. And here we're going to pick and choose which real-time control we are going to route to the pitch. In this case, I want to route my modulation wheel. I'm going to set the modulation depth all the way up. And you see this matrix of switches. And I'm going to activate this one. So it means that the wheel is now going to modulate the pitch with the LFO. So let's check that out. My mod wheel is currently set to its lowest point. Nothing happens. And as I turn it up, we hear the pitch modulation. I can turn up the speed, change the waveform, etc. And like I mentioned, we will use this PMod sensitivity to also tune the depth just as we want it. And we could have routed the pitch modulation to the other real-time controllers that are available, a foot controller, for example, a breath controller, or aftertouch. So if you press down a key and really press into it, if your MIDI controller has aftertouch, then you would hear the effect of the LFO come on. We can do the same thing with amplitude modulation. For that, make sure that the amplitude modulation is all the way to the left, or is inactive here. Make sure, remember, that the AMOD sensitivity switch is turned on in the particular operator. Then we're going to come here into the parameters window and select the wheel once again, but this time we're going to choose the amplitude column. Let's try it out. Okay, I'm going to turn my mod wheel all the way down. Now I'm going to start raising it. There's our amplitude modulation. And like I mentioned, with this switch, or with this control rather, we can tune the depth of the effect. The last real-time control option that I want to show you is what's called EG, or envelope generator bias. What this does is think that the EG bias is an output control of the operator. So if I set my wheel to control the EG bias, I'm going to control the output of the operator. It's like my modulation wheel now turns into a fader or a level control for the particular operator. So to set this up, we're going to activate the wheel switch on the EG bias column. And then we're going to come here into the specific operator we want to affect and make sure that the AMOD sensitivity switch is not set to 0. It has to have a value for this to work. Now I'm going to turn my modulation wheel all the way down. Let's play a note. As expected, since this is now a volume control or level control and the mod wheel is all the way down, we can't hear anything until I start to push it up, like so. So that's the EG bias control. The last section that we're going to cover in this video manual is the pitch envelope. The pitch envelope can be found all the way to the right here at the bottom, and the envelope should look very familiar, just like the envelopes on the operators. Now, the only thing is that this envelope is routed to the pitch. It's hard-coded. You can't do anything else but affect the pitch. And also very important to mention, the pitch envelope, or when we affect the pitch, it's going to affect the pitch of all the operators at the same time. We can't pick and choose which operators are going to be affected by the pitch envelope generator. It's all or nothing. A basic thing to understand is that by default, the level controls are set to 50. If you take a look here at the tiny screen, when I click on the control, it says level 50. And it makes sense because pitch can go up or can go down, right? So the baseline where pitch is unaffected is a value of 50. If you want the pitch to go up or down, then you're gonna push the knobs and assign a, in this case, a higher value, for example, 70, where we're bending it upward. And if I set it to the left, for example, check out the screen here. If it goes below 50, then it's being flattened. And then we use the rate to control the speed of going from one value to the next. So let's play this to see where we are. This is just a random example. Great. What if I turned it all the way up like that and make it slow and then go down like that, super fast? Cool. you can play with this and create the pitch change over time that you desire. This is great for special effects. Couple more things. As you're setting up the operators, sometimes you want to copy the settings from one operator to the next. So to do that, you can right-click, for example, here where it says EG level, and we can copy the operator values. Then I come here to another operator. Let's click here on the EG level, and I can select paste only the envelope values or paste the entire operator values. This is very useful. If I have a DX7 attached to my computer, I could, when I right-click, have the option of sending the current program or the current patch to the DX7, which is very cool. To map your MIDI keyboard to knobs and controls, you simply right-click on the knob or control that you want to map, select Map Controller, then move the controller on your keyboard, push the button, whatever it is, and then it'll get automatically assigned. So let's take care of that. I'm going to click on Map Controller. I'm just going to turn a controller on my keyboard, and there you go. There you see I'm controlling it. And if I want to clear it, just right-click, and I could say clear MIDI mapping or remove MIDI mapping for this controller. I'm going to clear the whole thing. Yeah. Great. So with this, we come to the end of this video manual, but I don't want to leave without showing you how to create a very simple patch. And this is going to be a very simple pad kind of patch. To do that, let's make sure that we have initialized our synth. And let's start with the envelope. This kind of pad that I want to make, I want it to have release and to have a slowish attack. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to slow down release number 4 of the first operator. Right there. Sounds good to me. Then I want to slow down rate number 1, which is the attack time. Right there is immediate. I just want to slow it down. Great. Once we get over the attack, I want the sound to decay very, very slowly. So no sustain. And right now, it has a very sharp drop. What I need to do is use rate 3 to give it more of a slope. So slow down rate 3. Right there, that's nice. Let's now turn up the level of our operator 2. If we look at this algorithm, operator 2 is modulating operator 1. I'm going to set it here, which is kind of an FM sawtooth wave. Let me copy the operator values by right-clicking, copy operator values, right-click, paste envelope values. But I'm going to make this one just faster a little bit and just a little bit slower in terms of release. Let me change the rate a little bit just so the envelope is not exactly the same as that of operator 1. Very nice. Let's do this. Let's create another system, a very simple FM stack, this time using operator 3 and 4 to do something similar as operator 1 and 2. I'm going to turn this one off just so we don't get confused. We can't hear anything. That's correct, because operator 3, which is our carrier, by default, its level's turned down to 0. So I'm going to turn this completely up. So now level 4 is going to be the modulator for carrier number 3. So let me turn up the level to where it sounds good. Nice. For this system, let me just slow down the attack a little bit. Like that. Let me slow down the release. Actually, let me turn off modulator 4. So we only hear carrier 3. Okay, I like this. Let's turn modulator 4 on. Let's copy the envelope over here. And let's just change it a little bit. So this system has a bit of a faster attack than the other system. Let's now turn on operator 1. Nice. A couple of things we can do are, let's introduce a little bit of detuning. Let's do that with the tune control. Let's set this one, operator 1, to -3, operator 2, or actually modulator 2 to -3 as well. Actually, let's go for -7 to get a bit of a faster modulation. Nice. Let's detune operators 3 and 4 just a tiny bit. I think this is very nice. Let's tweak both modulators 2 and 4 to see if we can give this patch a bit of a more of a warmer sound. So I'm just going to simply lower their level. And actually, let me change the envelope for modulator 4 just a little bit, just to give it a bit of a different shape. Something like this, maybe. And let's make operator 3 just a little bit faster. Sorry, a little bit slower. Not as slow as operator 1. Very nice. Let's give our patch a little bit of LFO action. Let's set it to sine. Let's turn up the PMD, or pitch modulation depth. Okay, now that's too much. Let's tweak the depth with this control and with the PMod sensitivity to where we want it. That's cool. What about the speed? That's nice. And what we can do is introduce a delay so it isn't always on, only when we hold down notes. And there you have it. In this kind of sound, I strongly recommend you use a chorus effect, some delay and reverb to make it shine even more. So there we go. I hope that you liked this, my friend, and found it useful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Take care.